Hey everybody, this is section 2 of chapter 3 of Marx Worldwide on the development of the international discourse on Marx since 1965. This book's by Jan Hoff and is translated by Nicholas Gray. Chapter 3 of the book is titled In-Depth Analyses, Central Discourses Within the German and International Discussions of Marx from the 1980s to the Present. And section 2 is titled The Problematic of Inquiry and Exposition in the Critique of Political Economy, with the headings 1. A quote, Mont Blanc of research material. 2. The ascent from the abstract to the concrete and the quote, problem of the beginning end quote, in Marx's presentation. 3. The relation of Marx's critique of political economy to Hegel's philosophy as reflected in the international debate. Summary. So here we go. The problematic of inquiry and exposition in the critique of political economy. Heading 1. A quote, Mont Blanc of research material. Footnote. In this subchapter, the engagement with Marx's process of inquiry within the history of the reception of Marx's critique of political economy will not be thematized. Rather, a brief treatment of Marx's process of inquiry itself will be offered, as this is indispensable on account of the interconnection between Marx's process of inquiry and his exposition. The question as to whether there is a specific method of inquiry in Marx and as to the features of such a method cannot be addressed here. End footnote. Of central importance in relation to Marx's understanding of his method is his distinction between inquiry and exposition. A well-known passage in Marx's Capital on this range of problems can be found in Marx's 1873 postface to the second edition of the first volume. Here, Marx comments as follows, quote, Of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze the material's different forms of development, and to track down their interconnection, end quote. Marx continues that it is only when this has been accomplished that the, quote, real movement, end quote, can be exposited appropriately. If this is done successfully, such that, quote, the life of the subject matter is now reflected back in the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction, end quote, Marx. Yet this semblance of a, quote, a priori construction, end quote, is deceptive. With these methodological indications, Marx brings the process of inquiry out from the shadow of the exposition and demonstrates that the former is the precondition of the latter. This passage has frequently been quoted or commented upon in the international discussion of Marx's method. It is worth noting that one of the most important exponents of the Japanese discussion of Marx of the post-war period, Sumizo Kuruma, held this methodological passage from the postface to the second edition of the first volume of Capital to be a more significant commentary by Marx on his method than the well-known, quote, chapter on method from the 1857 introduction to the Critique of Political Economy. The aim of Marx's inquiry is to gain knowledge with regard to the internal connections between the various economic categories and relations. It is only when the internal structure and laws of motion of the capitalist economy have been adequately penetrated and investigated that these can be exposited such that the, quote, life of the subject matter, end quote, is reflected ideally. For Marx, inquiry signified, among other things, the critical engagement with political economy, i.e. with this science as it had been elaborated before his time, and with the contributions to this discipline to be found in the corresponding contemporary literature. In this process, Marx endeavored to become acquainted with and to penetrate conceptually the widest possible horizon of economic thought. Authors working in connection with the Mega 2 edition have referred to Marx's, quote, evaluation of a literature so copious as to render an overview scarcely practicable, end quote. Hecker, Young, Nickel, and Kopf, 1991. On the source material which formed the foundation of Marx's inquiry, see Sirov, 1989. End footnote. From the beginning of his economic studies to shortly before his death, Marx not only made excerpts from the numerous economists which he categorized under different historical phases and various theoretical orientations, he was also concerned to do justice to the international character of economic theory formation and constantly to broaden his horizon in this regard. Of course, he was interested first and foremost in the development from William Petty via John Locke and Dudley North to the mid-18th century, and then via James Stewart to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the zenith of bourgeois economic thought, and finally to the various orientations which emerged after Ricardo. Marx also attached great significance to the Francophone development stretching from the Bois Guilbert via the physiocrats of Francois Quesnay, the, quote, vulgar economists Jean-Baptiste Say and Sismondi, whom Marx held in high esteem, to Bastiat, whom Marx criticized vehemently. However, Marx also devoted attention to economic thinkers from numerous other countries. He praised the American Benjamin Franklin. He received the work of Galliani, an 18th century Italian economist. He rebuked Charles H. Carey, an opponent of Ricardo considered by Marx to be an American counterpart of Bastiat. He commented on Spanish approaches to economic thought, and in his later years he increasingly registered economic literature of Russian origin. Footnote: Marx's formidable skills in foreign languages stood him in good stead for his evaluation of economic literature. See Sperl, 2004. End footnote. It's likely that Marx did not engage intensively with the science of political economy until after he relocated to Paris. In the course of 1844, the future author of Marx's Capital studied works by Jean-Baptiste Say, the Polish member of the Smithian school, Skarbek, the Ricardian McCulloch, the, quote, vulgar economist and, quote, Destutt de Tracy, the Ricardian James Mill. He also pored over Engels' text, Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy. Marx particularly engaged in a reception of the most important British economists of the 18th and 19th centuries, namely Adam Smith and David Ricardo. In 1844 was also the year in which Marx composed his first significant economic and philosophical work, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. This text was first published posthumously in 1932. Footnote: the publication of this previously scarcely known source material opened up a new perspective on the, quote, young Marx and provoked, quote, tremors, which shook the established image of Marx. It can be regarded as a long-term effect of the publication of this work in 1932 that the West German discussion of Marx often revolved around the, quote, young Marx until the 1960s, even if this is not the only explanation for the latter phenomenon. The latter phenomenon. Herbert Marcuse was one of the first commentators on the economic and philosophical manuscripts. End footnote. And there's two footnotes here that I missed. Footnote: Marx would later express the view that McCulloch, for whom he had a profound aversion, had, along with James Mill, contributed to the demise of the Ricardian school. End footnote. Footnote: it's likely that Marx first used the term, quote, vulgar economics in the so-called, quote, second draft of Capital, unquote. End footnote. In 1845 and 1846, Marx expanded and deepened his knowledge of economic literature, both in Brussels and also during library research undertaken together with Engels in England in July and August 1845. During this period, one of Marx's concerns was to gain a systematic overview of the history of political economy as a whole. Marx accordingly devoted his attention to several works dealing with the history of the science. By the time he wrote his polemic against Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, The Poverty of Philosophy, in 1847, Marx had to a large extent drawn close to Ricardo's theoretical position, even if he had not taken over this position himself. Footnote: an attempt to elaborate on the differences between Marx and Ricardo is made by Oishi, 1995. End footnote. However, Marx was still a long way from reaching the theoretical level that he would attain in the course of the elaboration of his, quote, mature critique of political economy. New opportunities were opened up to Marx as a result of his move to London in 1894. Quote, the enormous amount of material relating to the history of political economy assembled in the British Museum, the fact that London is a convenient vantage point for the observation of bourgeois society, and finally the new stage of development in which this society seemed to have entered with the discovery of gold in California and Australia, induced me to start again from the very beginning and to work carefully through the new material." End quote. Marx. Between the late summer of 1850 and December 1851, Marx filled 18 notebooks with extracts from economic works. 6 more from notebooks followed in the period up to 1853. These so-called, quote, London notebooks, end quote, contain above all excerpts relating to economic problems in the narrow sense, but also those pertaining to themes which transcend the boundaries of the discipline of political economy in the narrow sense. Among his other research activities, Marx once again embarked on an exhaustive study of the classical economists, James Stewart, Adam Smith, David Ricardo. He accorded an important status to the theory of money, the object of an intensive engagement by Marx in 1850-51, particularly in the first London notebooks. In a second stage of processing his accepted material in the spring of 1851, Marx compiled a collection of excerpts on the theory of money that he had made in Paris, Brussels, Manchester, and London, and added commentaries. Around the same time, he composed his first self-standing theoretical economic work since the resumption of his systematic studies. This text, which is little known in the international Marx debate, was entitled Reflection. Footnote. Rolf Hecker reports that there is at least a Spanish translation of Reflection, however. This text by Marx has also been published in Russian. Investigations of the manuscript Reflection are undertaken by Vygotsky, 1978, Schrader, 1980, and Christ, 1979. End footnote. In summary, it can be said that Marx deepened his economic knowledge enormously in the early 1850s, and thus laid a theoretical foundation without which he could not have written Marx's Capital in its published form. It should not be overlooked that Marx already anticipated some important results of his research in the early 1850s. This is true, for example, in relation to his rejection of the quantity theory of money. The early 1850s are to be regarded as a phase in Marx's creative process, and one which should by no means be underrated. A close textual comparison between passages in Bouillon, written in 1851, and the first notebook of the Grundrisse, written in 1857, reveals that Marx partially drew on his 1851 treatment of the theory of money in composing the latter text. However, it should be pointed out that in Marx's work, the processes of inquiry and exposition are sometimes intertwined, such that it's scarcely possible to clearly demarcate them. This is particularly true of the manuscripts dating from Marx's creative period from 1857 onwards. Thus, in the Grundrisse and Theories of Surplus Value, it is noticeable that the text still at times exhibits the character of a process of inquiry in which Marx is continually thinking through the material anew. This also occurs precisely in Marx's critical engagement with political economic thinkers. In the context of Marx's intensive reception of political economy, it should be noted that it was not, or at least not only, the impressive volume of material processed by Marx in his research which paved the way to an understanding of the internal structure of the capitalist economy. Rather, it was also the specific questions posed by Marx in relation to the material provided by this science which played a decisive role in enabling him to attain a comprehensive level of knowledge vis-a-vis the internal structure of the capitalist economy and the internal interconnection between economic categories by means of his critical engagement with economic science. In our letter written to Engels on the 20th of February 1866, Marx states in relation to the problematic of his exposition that, quote, the composition, the coherence is a triumph of German science, end quote. Marx. Marx presumably considered his manner of exposition to be a specific feature of his own theory formation, constituting a moment which enabled him to distinguish himself from the political economists who preceded him. It should be recalled here that in the book Theories of Surplus Value, Marx was extremely critical in his engagement with David Ricardo, specifically with regard to Ricardo's exposition and the architectonic of this exposition. In Marx's Capital, Marx is concerned with the specific internal connection within an organic whole constituted by economic categories. i.e., he focuses on the specific internal connection of these categories within an integral economic system which is articulated in a determinate way. In his logical exposition, Marx aimed to demonstrate this specific internal interconnection within a whole formed by economic categories by exhibiting their genetic development. Decisively, however, the process of exposition of Marx's critique of political economy presupposed an intensive process of inquiry. Yet although it is true that Marx first developed the systematic exposition of his, quote, mature critique of political economy from 1857 onwards, i.e. at a point in time when his process of inquiry was already at an advanced stage, it should by no means be inferred from this that the period between 1843/44 and 1857 corresponds to a phase of inquiry in Marx's work, with the subsequent period from the Grundrisse onwards representing a phase of exposition. From 1857 onwards, inquiry and exposition are tightly interwoven in the history of the elaboration of Marx's critique of political economy, and regarded as a whole, inquiry could by no means be said to retreat into the background to any great extent during this process. Alongside the drafting of systematic manuscripts on the critique of political economy, in which the dimension of inquiry is also present to some degree, Marx continued to make excerpts, and through his research activity, amassed a, quote, Mont Blanc of material to be processed. A large portion of this excerpted material from the period beginning in 1857 remains unpublished, including such extraordinarily important sources as the part devoted to the excerpts of Notebook 7, which Marx used for his research between 1859 and 1863, or the 8 supplementary notebooks, Notebooks A to H, which chronicle the process whereby Marx was able to gain a deeper level of knowledge of the historical phase of the emergence of political economy, among other things. Footnote: on the material referred to here, see Mueller 1977 and Schnickman 1979. On Marx's reception of Adam Smith in the part of Notebook 7 devoted excerpt, see Schrader 1983. End footnote. Finally, the theories of surplus value must also be understood, at least in part, as documenting a process of inquiry. Marx continued to make numerous excerpts relating to economic questions after 1863, including on the topics of the money market, crisis, the financial system, and landed property. Marx remained an active researcher into the 1870s and 1880s. A relatively short time before his death, he engaged with questions relating to currency, money, banking, and finance, for example. His research activity consisted not only in the reception of various theories of political economy, but also in recording empirical material and statistical analysis. An essay by Karl Erich Vollgraff demonstrates just how much importance Marx placed on his studies of empirical and statistical material in the late phase of his work on capital. According to Vollgraff, the USA became increasingly into Marx's field of vision as he collected empirical material. In his late correspondence, Marx emphasized that, quote, the most interesting field for the economist is now certainly to be found in the United States, and above all during the period of 1873 until 1878, the period of chronic crisis. The imbeciles in Europe who fancy that that theoreticians like myself and others are at the root of the evil might learn a wholesome lesson by reading the official Yankee reports. Here Marx alludes to the material on economic development in the USA, which he regularly consulted. Jan Hoff, end quote. Marx pursued his research activity until shortly before the end of his life. Even in his final years, Marx was still concerned with collecting immense quantities of material for further work on capital. From 1877 to 1879, for example, at a time when Marx's ability to work had long since been severely impaired, he completed 10 excerpt notebooks on economics. Marx's main focus here was the banking and financial system. The notebooks remain as yet unpublished. They are due to appear in Mega 2, Volume 4/25. When he was already more than 50 years old, Marx learned Russian in order to be able to undertake a systematic evaluation of the specialist literature in this language. An index entitled Russisches in my bookstall, unquote, which Marx compiled shortly before his death, registers the Russian language specialist literature which Marx had collected in his own private library. Footnote. That the Russices, this is in reference to the Russices in my bookstall, it means Russian material in my bookstall. Where am I? New section, section 2, or heading 2, the ascent from the abstract to the concrete in the, quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, in Marx's presentation. Footnote, Michal Kretka has rightly identified a, quote, asymmetry in terms of the attention, end quote, devoted to the beginning of the logical exposition of the Marxian critique of political economy relative to that accorded to its conclusion. Whereas the, quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, has been much discussed in Marx's interpretation, the question of the conclusion has been neglected. See Kretka, 2002. End footnote. Marx's method of exposition is often interpreted in the sense of an ascent from the abstract to the concrete in terms of the methodological dimension of the Marxian critique of political economy. Participants within the international Marx discussion often refer back to an excerpt drafted by Marx in the summer of 1857, i.e. before he began writing the Grundrisse, according to the dating given in Mega 2, Volume 2, which thematizes, among other things, an ascent from the abstract to the concrete. The text in question is the famous, quote, chapter on method, end quote, which is not published until after Marx's death. Marx begins his argumentation in the following way, quote, when we consider a given country politico-economically, we begin with its population, its distribution among classes, town, country, the coast, the different branches of production, export and import, annual production and consumption, commodity prices, etc. Marx. Marx continues, quote, it seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, with the real precondition, thus to begin in economics, e.g. the population, which is the foundation and subject of the entire social act of production, end quote. Marx continues, quote, it seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, with the real precondition, and thus to begin in economics, with e.g. the population, which is the foundation and subject of the entire social act of production, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Martin Nicholas translates Vorstellung as, quote, conception, end footnote. On closer examination, however, it can be ascertained that such a beginning is not the correct one. Population is an abstraction if, for example, the classes of which it is composed are disregarded. Quote, these classes in turn are an empty phrase if I am not familiar with the elements on which they rest, e.g. wage, labor, capital, etc. End quote. Marx. These latter, in turn, presuppose, quote, exchange, division of labor, prices, etc. ... For example, capital is nothing without wage, labor, without value, money, price, etc. End quote. Marx. Marx writes, quote, thus if I were to begin with the population, this would be a chaotic representation of the whole, end quote. Marx. By means of further determination, simpler concepts would be attained from the, quote, represented concrete towards ever thinner abstractions until I had arrived at the simplest determinations. From there, the journey would have to be retraced until I had finally arrived at the population again, but this time not as the chaotic representations of a whole, but as a rich totality of many determinations and relations, end quote. Marx. It would appear that the basic thought that Marx has in mind is that of a progression from the concrete to the abstract, and subsequently from the abstract back to the concrete. The latter is now differently determined, however. Marx draws a parallel between the two, quote, paths of thought outlined here, two currents in the history of economic thought. The first path of thought was that traced by early political economy, by economic thinkers of the 17th century. The latter, according to Marx, began with the living whole, with population, the nation, the state, several states, etc., and they always conclude by discovering through analysis a few determinate, abstract, general relations, such as division of labor, money, value, etc. However, According to Marx, the development of the economic science did not end there. Marx points to a later epoch of economic thought when he writes, quote, "As soon as these individual moments had been more or less firmly established and abstracted, these began the economic systems which ascended from the simple relations such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange value, to the level of the state, exchange between nations and the world market," end quote. This is followed by Marx's assessment that the latter, quote, "is obviously the scientifically correct method," end quote. Footnote. Zusammenfassung. Here and in the following sentence, there could be an argument for translating Zusammenfassung as, quote, "comprehension," as the term is rendered by Paul Greuer and Alan Wood in their translation of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Footnote. Des Mannigfaltigen. Martin Nicholas translates this as, quote, "the diverse." Anschauung. It seems appropriate to translate Anschauung as, quote, "intuition," the standard English translation for the term in Kant. For example, given that Marx deliberately uses a philosophical register in this context, in his translation, Martin Nicholas uses, quote, "observation" for Anschauung. End footnote. End footnote. Thus, it should not be overlooked that Marx considers what Marx considered in the summer of 1857 that this second path, which he attributed to a later historical epoch of economic theory, was entirely germane to his own theoretical development. This second path, however, presupposes the first. Marx continues his exposition and writes that the concrete is concrete because it, quote, "is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the manifold. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration, as a result, not as a point of departure, even though it is the point of departure in reality, and hence also the point of departure for intuition and representation. Along the first path, full representation was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along the second, the abstract determination leads towards a reproduction of the concrete by way of thought," end quote. Marx. Hegel had conceived the real as the result of, quote, "thought concentrating itself, probing its own depths and unfolding itself out of itself by itself," end quote. Marx. Footnote. Sich in sich zusammenfassenden. Arguably, this should be translated as, quote, "thought comprehending itself within itself," end quote. See above note for the translation of Zusammenfassung. End footnote. For Marx, however, the method of the ascent from the abstract to the concrete means the appropriation of the concrete by thought. Or rather, the reproduction of the concrete as the concrete in the mind. This is not to be confused with the real process by which the concrete itself comes into being. The, quote, "chapter on method" has been the subject of much controversy within the discussions around international Marx research in the last decades. However, with the publication in 1994 of a historical and systematic commentary by a Swiss working group on this famous excerpt from Marx's writings, a state of the research has been attained which establishes a benchmark for subsequent interpretations. A central interpretational premise of Judith Janoska, Martin Bondelli, and Konrad Kindler, and Mark Hofer, vis-a-vis the methodological reflections which Marx set down in August 1857, is the discrimination between different levels. Thus, the group of authors differentiates a, quote, "level of appropriation," end quote, from the, quote, "level of reality," end quote, and from a, quote, "level of historical reflection," end quote. The, quote, "level of appropriation," end quote, corresponds to the process of theoretical cognition. However, between this level and the, quote, level of reality, which corresponds to the real object itself, the relation is not the one posited by the theory of reflection. The, quote, level of historical reflection, quote, refers to the theoretical elaboration of the economic object in the history of the science of political economy. This is how is the methodological interpretation of Januszka, Bandelli, Kindler, and Hoff delineated in detail. In accordance with the differentiation between a, quote, level of reality and a, quote, level of appropriation, quote, the concrete has different meanings on the different respective levels. Vis-a-vis the, quote, level of reality, concepts such as, quote, abstract and, quote, concrete, or the, quote, abstract and the, quote, concrete, designate real forms of social existence. In relation to the, quote, level of appropriation, and, quote, on the contrary, it should be noted that the terms, quote, abstract and, quote, concrete, or the, quote, abstract and the, quote, concrete, and let me repeat that. The difference is between the and not the. So, in relation to the, quote, level of appropriation, on the contrary, it should be noted that the terms, quote, abstract and, quote, concrete, or, quote, the abstract, and, quote, the concrete, and, quote, refer to the corresponding stages of the conceptual appropriation of the object and the thought of the theoretician. According to Marx's, quote, chapter on method, the movement of the process of knowledge is from the concrete to the abstract, and finally from the abstract to the concrete. In terms of the first of the different meanings of the, quote, concrete, referred to by the Swiss group of authors, quote, the concrete corresponds to the, quote, level of reality, end quote, and is understood as, quote, a segment of reality as the object of appropriation and object of scientific work, end quote. Januszka, Bandelli, Kindler, and Hofer. This concrete is a real presupposition which remains outside the process of thought and exists independently of it. The real concrete is the point of departure for observation and representation. Quote, when it, bracket, the real concrete, in bracket, is taken up by the cognitive difficulty of sensibility, quote, representation, or, quote, represented concrete is yielded, a, quote, full, but also pejoratively a, quote, chaotic representation, end quote. Januszka, Bandelli, Kindler, and Hofer. From this second concrete, quote, the concrete of representation, end quote, the simplest categories and thinnest abstractions can be reached by means of further determination. Then, departing from this point, the movement of the process of cognition leads to the concrete in a third sense. Here it consists of a thought concrete in the sense of a rich, conceived totality of many determinations and relations. This second path, as is underlined by the Swiss commentary, traces the ascent from the abstract to the concrete. The Swiss group of authors expanded on the correlation indicated by Marx in the, quote, chapter on method, and, quote, between the two methodological paths and various thinkers within the history of economic thought as follows. Quote, our attempted reconstruction shows that there is a background within the history of economic thought which does indeed exhibit the methodological approaches projected on the tradition by Marx. Petty and Stewart can in fact be regarded as representatives of the, quote, first path, and Smith and Ricardo as exponents of the, quote, second. On the one hand, Marx refers to the economists of the 17th century, who began with the, quote, living whole, and discovered, quote, through analysis a small number of determinate abstract general relations, end quote. On the other, he alludes to the, quote, economic systems, which ascend from the simple relations such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange value, to the level of the state, exchange between nations and the world market, end quote. To summarize, the observation can be made in relation to the systematic and historical commentary on the, quote, chapter on method by the Swiss working group that these authors' theoretical strength lies in A, the rigorous analysis of this important methodological section in Marx's text in terms of the latter's conceptual content in relation to epistemological questions, and B, the discussion of this section within the context of the history of science and the history of philosophy. Marx's, quote, chapter on method, written in the summer of 1857, represents an important step within the process of his methodological self-clarification. As he developed the method he would employ in Marx's Capital, even if the text cannot be considered the last word on this method as it is exhibited in his magnum opus. Indeed, the method employed in Marx's Capital is the result of a concatenation of processes of inquiry and attempts at exposition over many years. Within the process of Marx's theoretical development, the methodological insights expounded in the, quote, chapter on method represent a transitional stage rather than an endpoint. Wait, let me make sure I'm recording again. And I am. It's fucking rock. In 1862, Marx presented important methodological considerations relating to the problem of exposition in the second part of Theories of Surplus Value, where he commented on Ricardo's method. According to Marx, Ricardo takes for granted the principle of the determination of value by labor time and proceeds to investigate whether, quote, the other economic relations contradict this determination of value or to what extent they really modify it, end quote. Marx. Footnote. It should be noted in relation to Marx's reception of Ricardo's theory of value that the adequacy of Marx's interpretation has at times been questioned within research in this area. A particular focus of criticism has been Marx's conception that Ricardo begins his exposition by setting out his labor theory of value, only then to commit the error of equating labor values and prices of production. The neo-Ricardian economist Ian Steedman rejects this criticism of Ricardo by Marx. Quote, Marx persistently misinterprets Ricardo's use of the term value to be his, Marx's use, and then accuses Ricardo of, quote, mistakenly identifying value and cost, bracket, or price of production, Jan Hoff, end bracket, terms which for Ricardo were simply synonyms, end quote. Ian Steedman. For Steedman, Ricardo reveals himself to be a theorist of prices of production. Due to limitations of space, this important problematic cannot be considered in any more detail here. Yeah, and I wonder how this is just interesting to me. I wonder how this relates to, like, because a lot of times, like, especially with this thing that, you know, this conception of Marx's labor theory of value and Ricardo's labor theory of value and so forth. I think it was said earlier in the book, or maybe I've read it elsewhere, that neo-Ricardians find Marx's labor theory of value redundant or something like that, or inessential. I don't know. A decisive feature of the Marxian method consists in the dimension of the mediation of the various economic categories with one another. The latter are at times to be located on completely different levels of abstraction. Wait, hold on. I skipped a space. Footnote. For an extensive overview of recent debates in relation to the so-called transformation problem, i.e. the problem of the transformation of values into prices of production, see Mosley 2015. And footnote. For Marx, the history of political economy reveals not only the scientific necessity of this procedure, but also of its, quote, scientific inadequacy, end quote. Quote, this inadequacy not only shows itself in the method of presentation, in a formal sense, but leads to erroneous results because it omits some essential links and directly seeks to prove the congruity of the economic categories with one another, end quote. Marx. A decisive feature of the Marxian method consists in the dimension of the mediation of the various economic categories with one another. The latter are at times to be located on completely different levels of abstraction. This is something Marx knew he needed to consider in his conception of the exposition. As the above quotation from Theories of Surplus Value indicates, Marx was able to identify a grave methodological deficit in Ricardo's approach. Yet it is strikingly typical of Marx's procedure that he insists on the historical justification and necessity of Ricardo's method. In his assessment of the scientific achievements of political economists, Marx did not merely pay heed to the criterion of the correctness of their views. He also took account of the respective role that corresponded to them in the historical development of this science. This can be illustrated by referring to Marx's subsequent assessment in relation to the history of the formation of economic theory. Marx judged that Ricardo, within the context of his method, was able to overcome the alleged dualism of Smith, which consisted in an oscillation between a, quote, esoteric and a, quote, exoteric element of theory. Footnote. Marx writes that Smith, quote, moves with great naivety in a perpetual contradiction. On the one hand, Smith traces the intrinsic connection existing between economic categories of the obscure structure of the bourgeois economic system. On the other, he simultaneously set forth the connection as it appears in the phenomena of competition, and thus as it presents itself in the to the unscientific observer, just as to him who is actually involved and interested in the process of bourgeois production, end quote. Marx. End footnote. On the one hand, the scientific value of Ricardo's method is evident, according to Marx. On the other hand, however, the, quote, scientific deficiencies of his procedure are clearly visible, end quote. Marx. Marx's line of thought emphasizes the necessarily inverted and extremely peculiar architectonic of the British political economist, which, according to Marx, is closely connected to Ricardo's method. The latter consists, on Marx's view, in the confrontation between economic categories and the basic principle of the determination of value by labor time. Footnote, quote, the faulty architectonics of the theoretical part, bracket, of Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, i.e. of the first 6 chapters of his work, Jan Hoff, end bracket, is not accidental. Rather, it is the result of Ricardo's method of investigation itself and of the definite task which Ricardo set himself in his work. It expresses the scientific deficiency of this method of investigation itself, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The latter consists, on Marx's view, in the confrontation between economic categories and the basic principle of the determination of value by labor time. Footnote. Quote, thus the entire Ricardian contribution is contained in the first 2 chapters of his work. In these chapters, the developed bourgeois relations of production, and therefore also the developed categories of political economy, are confronted with their principle, the determination of value, and examined in order to determine the degree to which they directly correspond to this principle, and the position regarding the apparent discrepancies which they introduce into the value relations of commodities. These chapters contain the whole of his critique of hitherto existing political economy, the categorical break with the contradiction that pervades Adam Smith's work through its esoteric and exoteric modes of consideration. And at the same time, because of this critique, they produce some quite new and startling results, hence the great theoretical satisfaction afforded by these first 2 chapters, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Marx expounds his critique of Ricardo's method as follows. In the first chapter of Principles, i.e. the chapter on value, quote, not only are commodities assumed to exist, and when considering value as such, nothing further is required, but also wages, capital, profit, the general rate of profit, and even, the various forms of capital as they arise from the process of circulation, and also the difference between, quote, natural and market price, end quote, unquote. Marx. A similar criticism of Ricardo is to be found in Marx's correspondence. In a letter written in 1868 to Ludwig Kugelmann, Marx raises the critical objection against Ricardo that, quote, in his first chapter on value, he presupposes as given, all possible categories which are still to be developed, in order to prove their adequacy vis-a-vis the law of value, end quote. Marx. A consequence of Ricardo's procedure is that economic categories which are in fact only to be developed at a later stage of the exposition are already taken as given at a relatively early stage, or even from the outset. A footnote by Marx reveals that he was concerned to avoid similar problems in his own exposition, i.e. in the chapter on the commodity at the beginning of the first volume of Capital. Quote, the reader should note that we are not speaking here of wages or value the worker receives, e.g. for a day's labor, but for the value of the commodity in which his day of labor is objectified. At this stage of our presentation, the category of wages does not exist at all, end quote. Marx. In the book Theories of Surplus Value, in the context of his reception of the section of Ricardo's text on the modification of the principles of the determination of value by the quantity of labor, Marx accuses the British economic scientist of lacking the power of abstraction. Quote, all of Ricardo's illustrations only serve Ricardo as a means to smuggle in the presupposition of a general rate of profit. The presupposition of a general rate of profit. And this happens in the first chapter, on value. While wages are supposed to be developed only in the 5th chapter and the profits in the 6th, how from the mere determination of the, quote, value of the commodities, their surplus value, the profit, and even a general rate of profit are derived remains obscure to Ricardo. In the fact, the only thing which he proves in the above illustration is that the prices of the commodities, insofar as they are determined by the general rate of profit, are entirely different from their values. And he arrives at this difference by postulating the rate of profit to be law. One can see that though Ricardo is accused of being too abstract, one would be justified in accusing him of the opposite, the lack of the power of abstraction, inability when dealing with the values of commodities to forget profits, a factor which confronts him as a result of competition, end quote. Marx. Through his engagement with the chapter on value in Marx's major work, Principles of Economy and Taxation, Marx gained a clear idea of how an adequate beginning of the exposition should not be formulated. With regard to the, quote, production of the beginning, end quote, the, quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, Marx's own exposition, the question arises as to which title the opening chapter of the exposition should bear. The title of the first chapter of the Resurgence of 1857-58 reads as follows, quote, 2. The chapter on money, end quote. As indicated by the editors of Mega 2, the Mega 2 volume containing the Grundrisse, Marx inserted the title at a later point and added the numeration at the latest when he began a section entitled, quote, value, which is to precede the chapter on money. In relation to the problem of the beginning of the exposition in Marx, Rosdolsky comments that the necessity of correcting the, quote, idealist manner of presentation, end quote, prompted the Trier-born theorist to choose the commodity as the starting point of the exposition of his text, a contribution to the critique of political economy, which was written between November 1858 and January 1859. In advancing this thesis, Rosdolsky relies on a famous passage from the first notebook of the Grundrisse. Footnote. Here Marx writes, quote, it will be necessary later, before this question is dropped, to correct the idealist manner of presentation, which makes it seem as if it were merely a matter of conceptual determinations and of the dialectic of these concepts, above all in the case of the phrase product or activity becomes commodity, exchange value money, end quote, Marx, end footnote. It is difficult to determine when precisely Marx decided to give the first chapter the title The Commodity rather than Value. In one of the best-known letters written by Marx in the period shortly before he finished working on Rohentwerf to Engels on the 2nd of April 1858, it is clear that he still intends the title of the first chapter of the section, quote, A, capital in general, end quote, to be, quote, value. Marx hoped that his work will be published in the form of serialized notebooks, the first of which was to contain the chapter dealing with value, which he had broken off at an early stage, such that it remained fragmentary in the corresponding version in the Rohentwerf. To this extent, in June 1858, Marx embarked on an intensive review of his own Grundrisse and compiled an index of everything which he considered important in relation to the range of themes to be handled in the respective installments of his work. This, quote, index to the 7 notebooks, or its first version, contains a plan for the architectonic of the critique of political economy, extending from the, quote, beginning of the exposition to the circulation of capital. In this plan, it is clearly still Marx's intention to have an opening chapter titled Value, quote, value. In the latter half of 1858, in August, according to the Mega 2 editors, Marx began drafting the text of a contribution to the critique of political economy, but broke off work on the manuscript in autumn of 1858. As well known, only parts of the chapter on money and the beginning of the chapter on capital have been preserved from this manuscript, which was unpublished in Marx's lifetime. The editors of the Mega 2, Volume 2/2, claim that Marx drafted a chapter on value as the opening chapter of the text. This claim cannot be verified. Footnote: the Mega 2 editors based their claim on a text by Marx from the summer of 1861 entitled Referate zu meinen eigenen Heften, where he registers the temporary existence of a, quote, notebook C, which is not extant, at least as a complete notebook. However, there is no direct, unambiguous proof that this notebook contained a chapter of the text on value. End footnote. According to the editors of Mega 2, Marx commenced work in November 1858 on the version of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which was subsequently published in 1859. He had taken the decision to entitle the opening chapter The Commodity rather than Value by the end of November 1858 at the latest. This much at least can be inferred from Marx's correspondence, specifically from his letter to Engels of the 29th of November 1858. It would appear at any rate that it was not until he had finished working on the Grundrisse that Marx resolved to prepare a draft on an opening chapter with the title, The Commodity. The commodity is also the initial category in Capital. The commodity of the beginning of Marx's exposition in this work is a concretum, a simple concrete to borrow Raphael Echeverria's formulation, but simultaneously also an abstractum due to its as yet undetermined form character. This is so because decisive dimensions of its form determinacy, its determinate being, as a capitalistically produced commodity, as a component of a commodity capital, remain to be determined in the course of Marx's exposition. In the piece titled Notes on Adolf Wagner's Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie, a study which constitutes Marx's last text on the critique of political economy, Marx elucidates his own procedure in the first volume of Capital. This late text by Marx is particularly revealing with regard to the problem of the beginning of the exposition and clarifies important aspects of Marx's understanding of his method. Here Marx writes that he did not choose, quote, concepts, or the, quote, concept of value as his starting point. His point of departure is either the, quote, the simplest social form in which the product of labor presents itself in contemporary society, and this is the, quote, commodity, unquote, unquote. Marx states that he analyzes the commodity initially in its form of manifestation. Here he finds that it is on the one hand a use value in the commodity's natural form, and on the other a, quote, bearer of exchange value. And from this point of view, it is itself a, quote, exchange value, end quote, unquote, Marx. According to Marx, the analysis of the latter dimension of the commodity shows that exchange value is a form of manifestation of commodity value. Marx then, quote, starts on the analysis of the latter, end quote. Marx clearly states how his method is not to be understood. Quote, thus I do not divide value into use value and exchange value as opposites into which the abstraction, quote, value splits up. Rather, I divide the concrete social form of the product of labor, the, quote, commodity. The latter is on the one hand use value and on the other, quote, value, not exchange value, since the mere form of appearance is not its own content, end quote. Marx further argues that his analysis of the commodity at the beginning of his exposition does not merely refer to the dual character of the commodity as the unity of use value and value, but also to the dual character of the labor objectified in the commodity. With regard to the, quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, of Marx's exposition, two significant contributions to research from the discussion of the 1980s and 1990s can now be considered. Gerhard Güller's 1980 habilitation thesis on the structure of Marx's exposition, within the respective sections on the commodity and the exchange process, revolves around the question of the status of dialectic in Marx's exposition. In this connection, Guler focuses on the first chapter of the book, a contribution to the critique of political economy on the one hand, and on sections on the commodity and exchange process in the first two editions of Marx's Capital, 1867 and 1872/3 on the other. According to Guler, a distinction between two different types of dialectic can be discerned by comparing Marx's various approaches to his exposition with specific reference to the manner in which money and the exchange process are developed from the category of the commodity. Guler considers a, quote, emphatic dialectic, end quote, to be operative in the book, a contribution to the critique of political economy. Particularly decisive here in Guler's view is Marx's conception of contradiction. In the case of, quote, emphatic dialectic, the Berlin-based political scientist argues that an explicative function can be attributed to contradiction within the context of argumentation, i.e. the movement of the contradiction itself is the decisive driving force within the categorical development and the progression of the exposition. Guler maintains, however, that the execution of the emphatic dialectic is miscarried in the development of commodities, money, and exchange process. In the book, a contribution to the critique of political economy, quote, the failure of the emphatic dialectic, which is comprehensively applied in the development of money and the exchange process, is ... a result of the fact that elements are placed together which do actually belong together objectively, but which of a necessity, which is equally objective, must be developed separately from one another, end quote. According to Guler, the universal equivalent is the result of the sequential development of the value form, whereas the exchange process is conceived of as the result of the development of a contradiction. The execution of this latter development alone would not, quote, yield the universal equivalent, end quote. Guler argues as follows, quote, since the development of the value form is not fully integrated into the development of the exchange process, the development of the contradiction in the exchange process cannot be executed in a continuous and comprehensive way for its relevant elements, and thus cannot be rigorously carried through in an emphatic sense. Yet this is what is required in order to sustain this development, end quote. Guler. By contrast, the dialectic is, quote, reduced, according to Guler, in both the above-mentioned editions of Marx's Capital. The Berlin-based political scientist refers in this context to a descriptive as opposed to explicative function of contradiction. With regard to Marx's Capital, Guler explains that, quote, the difficulties of the interconnection between forms of value and the exchange process, ... are removed from the main development and concentrated within a separate treatment of the exchange process, end quote. Guler surmises that there was a break in Marx's relation to Hegel between a contribution to the critique of political economy and Capital, with Marx turning away from Hegel, although Guler argues that Marx never completely broke free from Hegel's influence. Although Guler's study represents one of the milestones within the German language methodological discussion of Marx, there has not been a reception of his approach in other countries that could compare with the reception of the work of Hans-Georg Backhaus, for example. In Germany, however, Guler represents one of the essential points of reference for the methodological discussion of the critique of political economy, with his approach meeting with both approval, for instance, from Christian Eiber, in relation to the determination of the relation between the structure of the value form and the chiastic structure of exchange, and criticism. Footnote: Christian Eiber has published a lecture series held at the Institute for Philosophy of the Free University of Berlin in book form. See Eiber 2005. End footnote. Among the criticisms of Guler's approach is that leveled by Helmut Brentel as the former central thesis of, quote, Marx's reduction of the dialectic, end quote, which Brentel finds unpersuasive. Another critique by Dieter Wolff focuses in particular on Guler's understanding of contradiction in Marx. Footnote: on the critical engagement with Guler, see Brentel, 1989, Wolf, 2002, and Michael Heinrich also criticizes Guler in Heinrich, 1999. End footnote. An original contribution to the discussion of the, quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, of the critique of political economy is the thesis developed by the Argentinian-Mexican philosopher and theologian Enrique Dussel in research carried out in the 1980s and 1990s. In his analysis of the, quote, chapter on method in the 1857 Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy, Dussel argues that the ascent from the simple and abstract to the intellectually concrete, to the complex, to the concrete totality as a dialectical element. According to Dussel, the structure of categories in the critique of political economy is prescribed by their internal interconnection in modern capitalist society. In the first book in this trilogy, Dussel also investigates Marx's conception of the logic of his exposition from the plan outlined in the 1857 introduction to the, quote, index to the 7 notebooks compiled by Marx in 1858. As was indicated above, in the second book of his trilogy, Dussel refers not only to the 1861-63 manuscripts, in which Marx follows up on his text, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, but also to the later text itself. Dussel points out that although Marx indicates his intention to, quote, to choose, quote, value as the title for his opening section in his letter to Engels on the 2nd of April 1858, as well as in his, quote, index in the 7 notebooks, and quote, he then, in a letter to Engels dated 13th of January 1859, refers to his opening chapter under the heading of the, quote, commodity. Dussel's research can be supplemented here as follows. Marx already gives the, quote, commodity as the title of his opening chapter to in a letter to Engels dated the 29th of November 1858. According to Dussel, the structure of the text of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, a text which was drafted in the latter half of 1858 before Marx composed the published version of A Contribution, is already anticipated in a letter written to Engels on the 2nd of April 1858. The structure is the following: value, money, capital. As is well known, it is not only a contribution to the critique of political economy that begins with the category of the commodity, it is also true of Marx's capital. Dussel interprets the individual commodity as the elementary existence of bourgeois wealth. As a unity of use value and value, the commodity is the category which forms Marx's starting point. Value is in turn interpreted by the Argentinian as the, quote, fundamental being, end quote, of capital. Yet there is also a further line of argument in Dussel's search for the category that forms the starting point of Marx's critique of political economy. For Dussel, the most fundamental opposition which Marx establishes in his critique of political economy is not so much that between concrete, useful, and abstract universal labor, but that between use value and value. The Argentinian philosopher maintains instead that it is first and foremost the antagonism between, quote, living labor and, quote, objectified labor which is accorded central significance. Dussel argues that, quote, living labor has a decisive function and advances the conception that, as the source of value and surplus value, living labor is extrinsic to capital. This source is subsumed by capital, however. The crux of Dussel's interpretation of Marx is that the category of, quote, living labor is the actual starting point of the dialectical exposition. For the Argentinian, quote, living labor is actually a primordial category within the structure of categories. In fact, it is the very first. In turn, quote, living labor stands in opposition to, quote, objectified labor, which is thus of a similar relevance for the beginning of the dialectical exposition. The Latin American philosopher and theologian writes, quote, the dialectical logical movement of capital begins in the radical contradiction of, quote, living labor and, quote, objectified labor as capital, end quote. Dussel. Nevertheless, this raises the question as to what to make of a beginning of an exposition, which has the, quote, commodity as its starting point, as is undeniably the case in the first volume of Capital. On Dussell's interpretation, there are evidently two beginnings, each with a different status. Dussel argues as follows in El Ultimo Marx, quote, in effect, it was necessary to begin with Chapter 1 on the commodity of money, ... in order to comply with a pedagogical order, or the order of the, quote, exposition. Logically, however, it was necessary to start with the absolute contradiction between, quote, money and living labor, end quote. Dussel. It's worth taking a closer look at Dussell's line of argument here. The Argentinian considers that the function of Marx's plans for the architectonic of his critique of political economy is to problematize the, quote, ordering of economic categories within the context of the development of the concept of capital. Yet Dussel establishes a distinction here in terms of the, quote, ordering of the inquiry, end quote, which is a matter of a logical essence-related ordering, the fourth chapter of the second edition of Marx's Capital, or the second chapter of the first edition, i.e. the section of Marx's text containing the transformation of money into capital, is to be located at the beginning. With regard to the, quote, ordering of the exposition, end quote, however, the first chapter of Marx's Capital represents the beginning. Dussel understands this, quote, ordering of the exposition, end quote, to be, quote, pedagogical. The circumstance that the commodity is the first category to be exhibited does not signify for Dussel that it also occupies first place in the essence-related, quote, internal ordering of categories. In fact, quote, living labor constitutes a central categorical point of reference in Marx's work for Dussel. According to the Argentinian philosopher and theologian, it is the creatrix of all value and all wealth, and economic categories such as value, the commodity, money, etc. are its modalities. Dussel also attributes a central significance to the category of, quote, living labor within the context of his emphatic reference to the character of Marxian theory as critique, insofar as it regards Marx's critique of political economy as one that is undertaken from the perspective of, quote, living labor. Within the Anglo-Saxon discussion, the theory formed by Dussel has been the cause of some controversy. Patrick Murray has voiced criticisms of several aspects of Dussel's theory. A major point of criticism is associated with Murray's critical view of so-called, quote, Ricardian Marxism. Murray argues that a distinction is to be drawn between Marxian theory on the one hand and, quote, Ricardian Marxism on the other. It is only Marxian theory and not Ricardian Marxism which theorizes the specific social form of labor within the capitalist mode of production. Murray places Dussel under the rubric of, quote, Ricardian Marxism and defines the latter as follows, quote, the hallmark of Ricardian Marxism is that it takes the theory of surplus value to be the heart and soul of Marx's critique of capitalism, end quote. Murray argues that Dussel underestimates the importance of Marx's exposition of the sphere of simple circulation at the beginning of the exposition in Capital, and likewise the problematic of the specific social form, which is the object of Marx's exposition. This element of Murray's critique of Dussel is relevant in relation to the problem of the beginning in Marx's exposition, since it is not in this context, it is in this context that the question of the significance of Marx's exposition of the category of the commodity and the categories, plural, the categories of the commodity and money, i.e. the categories of the first section of the second edition of Marx's Capital, can be posed. A response to Murray's critique of Dussel was formulated by Fred Mosley. The latter takes the view that the, quote, heart and soul, end quote, of Marx's critique of capitalism encompasses both his theory of surplus value and exploitation on the one hand and his theory of specific forms on the other. Mosley maintains that the category of the commodity is to be considered the logical starting point with regard to Marx's exposition of his theory of capitalism. Mosley also notes that, quote, an important point of agreement between Murray and myself, and with Dussel as well, is that Marx's Capital is about capitalism from the very beginning. That is from chapter 1 of volume 1, end quote. Mosley. Short shrift is given here to any interpretation which holds that the beginning of Marx's exposition is concerned with a pre-capitalist, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. Heading 3. The relationship of Marx's critique of political economy to Hegel's philosophy is reflected in the international debate. In connection with the international debate on the problematic of Marx's exposition, it is necessary to undertake a closer examination of a theme which has been the subject of intensive discussion and scientific research on Marx's method in his critique of political economy, namely Marx's relation to Hegel. In this context, the central focus is the relation of Marx's, quote, mature critique of political economy to Hegel's philosophy, rather than the extensive reception of Hegel undertaken by Marx in his early work. In the second part of this work, two interpretive orientations, those of the Delavolpian and Althuserian schools, were considered, whose position with regard to Marx's relation to Hegel was characterized above all by the foregrounding of a sharp demarcation between these two thinkers. Although it is obvious that, quote, anti-Hegelianism is by no means represents a differentia specifica of Althusser and Coletti, it should be noted that the Delavolpian school stood at the head of the, quote, anti-Hegelian movement within Marxism, at least in Western Europe. Within a number of varieties of Marxism, including Soviet or Eastern European Orthodox Marxism, Japanese and Latin American Marxism, there were certain tendencies which were opposed to any, quote, Hegelianization of Marxian theory. In the case of Latin American Marxism, this opposition was mediated by the local reception of Althusser. Also worth noting in this context is the anti-Hegelian orientation of the Anglo-Saxon, quote, analytical Marxism of the 1980s. In parts of the debate of the 1960s and 1970s, however, there already existed a current of interpretation of the Hegel-Marx relation, which deviated from anti-Hegelian interpretations. An example of this current can be seen in the positive reference to Hegel within the Marx interpretation of Hans-Jürgen Kroll. It should by no means be assumed, then, that it is legitimate to make unqualified generalizations about a, quote, anti-Hegelianism within the Marx debate of the 1960s and 1970s. Since that period, there has been a further development in the state of the discussion internationally. It is worth recalling here various theoretical approaches of the 1990s which distance themselves from the anti-Hegelian discourse, including that of the Iranian Ali Shamsavari, a, quote, new dialectic approach proposing a positive redefinition of the Hegel-Marx relation has emerged at approximately the same time within the Anglo-Saxon world. Yet, quote, anti-Hegelianism cannot be said to have disappeared from the international Marx debate in recent times, as can be demonstrated by reference to the interpretive approach of John Rosenthal. I have the introduction to John Rosenthal's book on this channel. The relation of the Marxian to the Hegelian method can by no means be reduced to a mere, quote, application or, quote, transfer. The complexity of the Hegel-Marx relation should not be underestimated. Marx engaged critically with Hegel's book Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, and Hegel's Logic, both the Science of Logic and the Encyclopedia Logic. Marx undertook his reception of Hegel both in various theoretical contexts and at different periods in the production of his theoretical works. Marx adopted different positions vis-a-vis Hegel at different points in time. Within international research on Marx, there is in general a high level of familiarity with the sources documenting his critical engagement with Hegel. Worthy of mention in this context, alongside the critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right of 1843 and other writings from this same decade, are Marx's mature works on the critique of political economy, including his 1857 Introduction and the postface to the second edition of the first volume of Capital, as well as his correspondence. Other sources are less well known, however, With regard to the period from 1857 onwards, in addition to the numerous better-known passages from texts where Marx engages critically with Hegel's philosophy, an excerpt made by Marx from the Encyclopedia Logic has also been preserved. Hey, you're crazy. Squirrel got real close. I'm one with the squirrels. Where the hell am I? With regard to the period from 1857 onwards, in addition to the numerous better-known passages from texts where Marx engages critically with Hegel's philosophy, an excerpt made by Marx from the Encyclopedia Logic has been preserved. It is difficult to date Marx's excerpt, although it was probably made at the beginning of the 1860s, although the corresponding volume of Mega 2 has not as yet been published. This excerpt has been available to the scientific community for decades, and yet it has thus far received little attention in specialist circles. In the 1960s, the Czechoslovak philosopher Jindřich Zelení distinguished 4 different stages in Marx's critical engagement with Hegel's philosophy. The first stage identified by Zelení occurs in Marx's 1841 dissertation titled The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. The second stage corresponds to Marx's 1843 critical reception of Hegel's philosophy of right. The third stage is associated with the book Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. The fourth stage comprises the German ideology and the poverty of philosophy. Zelení considers the latter 2 stages to be particularly significant. The Czech philosopher regards the period from 1844 to 1847 as the most important and philosophically richest period in Marx's reception of Hegel. Yet how on this basis would Zelení classify those of Marx's critical engagements with Hegel that are documented in his 1857 introduction? In his, quote, mature work from 1857/58 onwards, and not least in his correspondence with from his London period, Zelení responds as follows, quote, the question whether, in the further development of Marx's thought in the relation to Hegel's philosophy, there are any changes or modifications which could be described as constituting a new, specific stage in Marx's critical confrontation with Hegel, must be answered in the negative. The relation of Marx to Hegel remains in essence as elucidated in principle by the former following a relatively complicated development in the fourth stage of his reception of Hegel, i.e. the book The German Ideology and the book The Poverty of Philosophy, end quote. Jindřich Zelení. In the 1980s, Andreas Arndt distinguished various phases of Marx's engagement with Hegel from 1857 onwards. Arndt identifies Marx's work on the 1857 introduction as marking the beginning of a period of intensive critical confrontation with Hegel. This was followed, however, by a temporary, quote, virtual silence in relation to Hegel on the part of Marx once he had resumed his work on the book A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in 1861. While working on his 1861-63 manuscripts, and more precisely on his theories of surplus value, written during the course of 1862, Marx engaged critically with the problematic of the method of political economy. According to Arndt, Marx reconsidered the category of contradiction at this time. Arndt writes as follows, quote, after his intensive experimentation with Hegel during the concluding phase of his inquiry into the systematic interconnection of the categories of bourgeois society and his first attempt at an exposition up to 1859, both of which served to clarify for Marx the outline of the system of the critique of political economy, the program of dialectic is first concretized through the elucidation of the category of contradiction in his direct critical engagement with the method of bourgeois economics, end quote. Andreas Arndt. I think Andreas Arndt is a big Hegel scholar in Germany. Footnote. Arndt's study has recently been republished with the addition of a new afterword. See Arndt 2012. End footnote. Arndt discerns a continuous critical engagement by Marx with the problem of dialectic and Hegelian philosophy during the period from 1865 to 1868. Arndt maintains that subsequently, from the late 1860s up to Marx's death in 1883, this critical engagement rather recedes into the background. Footnote. In another study, Arndt emphasizes a specific concept of objective mediation which he discerns in Marx. For a recent approach by Arndt to Marx's relation to Hegelian dialectics, see Arndt 2008. See also Arndt 2013 for a subsequent contribution on this theme. And footnote. In the context of the question to the theoretical relation between Marx's critique of political economy and Hegel's thought, is worth indicating by means of a short excursus on Hegel's treatment of political economy the fundamental difference between the way in which Hegel and Marx confronted this science. This short excursus on Hegel's engagement with economic theory is also rendered necessary by the emergence in the 1990s of a novel situation in the history of the debate around the reception of Hegel and Marx. An interpretive current has formed within the Anglo-Saxon discussion of the Hegel-Marx relation, at least according to the account given by Ian Fraser and Tony Burns in their historical survey of this debate, which is broken with the previous orientations guiding the exegesis of this theoretical relation. According to Fraser and Burns, this new interpretative tendency takes a radically different path, one which, it might be added, does not so much involve a specific or novel interpretation of Marx, but rather of Hegel. To put it concisely in this context, Hegel is not construed as an idealist, but as a materialist. Fraser and Burns point out, however, that the central focus of this interpretive current is not so much Hegel's metaphysics as his economic, social, and political thought. Quote, insofar as he is of significance for the history of Marxism, the true importance of Hegel in this view is to be found in his social and political thought, or in what is usually referred to as real philosophy, rather than in his general philosophy or his metaphysics, end quote. Fraser and Burns. These two authors expand upon this point as follows, quote, from this point of view, then, there is no need for Marxists to appropriate a modified materialist version of Hegel's philosophical idealism into their own thought. For Marx's, quote, materialism can be derived directly from Hegel's own social thought without any such adaptation or modification, end quote. Fraser and Burns. Thus, the, quote, fundamental claim that is made that by this new reading of the Hegel-Marx connection, end quote, consists in the assertion, quote, that Hegel's dialectic and Marx's dialectic are one and the same, end quote. Fraser and Burns. Footnote. Regardless of the evaluation that might be made in relation to this new approach by the interpretation of the Hegel-Marx relation, and of Hegelian thought in particular, it is in any case clear that given the existence of this new interpretation, an exclusive or one-sided focus on the relation of Marx's critique of political economy to the science of logic or to the phenomenology of spirit is no longer permissible, and that Hegel's engagement with economic and social questions merits some attention. Hegel's relation to the science of political economy is much discussed in research on Hegel. Crucially, Hegel integrated his references to political economy with his philosophy of right and social philosophy, or to be more precise, within his corresponding theory of civil society. Footnote. The convention Footnote. Bürgerlichen Gesellschaft. The convention in English translation of Hegel's philosophy of right is to render Bürgerliche Gesellschaft as, quote, civil society, although it should be borne in mind that the term is translated in many other contexts as, quote, bourgeois society. End footnote. This is to say that although Hegel recognized political economy as an independent science, it did not have this status in his own treatment. Jürgen Kaczynski has referred to, quote, Hegel's philosophization, end quote, of the economy, end quote. Kaczynski. Georg R. Weiler perceives a certain, quote, dilettantism at work in the way Hegel refers to the economic problematic. A well-known statement of the philosopher in relation to, quote, political economy, quote, is set out in section 189 of the book Elements of the Philosophy of Right. For Hegel, quote, political economy is a science whose development, quote, is of interest in showing how thought extracts from the endless multitude of details with which it is initially confronted the simple principles of the thing, bracket Sache, and bracket, the understanding which works within it and controls it. See Smith, Say, and Ricardo, end quote. A question arising in relation to this paragraph and its listing of economists, Adam Smith, Jean-Baptiste Say, and David Ricardo, is that of Ricardo's reception of these economic thinkers. It is likely that Hegel was better acquainted with the Scots, i.e. Smith's theory, than with that of the other two economists. Footnote. With regard to Hegel's terminology, Norbert Wojak refers to a science, quote, which Hegel designates in his Elements of the Philosophy of Right, employing the unusual expression, quote, Staatseconomie, end quote, but which he also refers to, for the most part synonymously, as, quote, politische economy and, quote, national economy, end quote, unquote. Norbert Wojak. Footnote. Norbert Wojak writes that although it is unlikely that, quote, Hegel had a noticeable direct knowledge of Say or Ricardo, that is why there are no other references and no identifiable allusions to their writings. He knew of them probably through the review journals. He perceived them as independent followers of Smith, and he thus appreciates, and one need not read more into the reference, that Say and Ricardo, along with Smith, are the acknowledged leaders of the subject, end quote. Wojak. According to Andreas Arndt, Hegel became acquainted with Ricardo through Say. Arndt points out that Hegel's literary estate contains Say's 1819 text Principe de l'économie politique par Dave Ricardo. End footnote. However, Andreas Arndt suspects that there are considerable omissions in Hegel's reception of Smith. In the book, Elements of the Philosophy of Right, Hegel showed no interest in the Scots' approaches to the theory of value or his distinction between use value and exchange value. Footnote. According to Arndt, it is doubtful whether Hegel ever, quote, read more than the first chapter in the first volume of Wealth of Nations, end quote. Andreas Arndt argues that, quote, otherwise it would be difficult to explain the fact that Hegel was unable to see the problem of wage labor and capital despite his references to Smith, end quote. Arndt. End footnote. A further important question for Hegel research is that of his reception of the economic thought of James Stewart. In his mid-20th century study of the young Hegel, Georg Lukács alerted a broad readership to an annotated commentary to Stewart's 1767 Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy written by Hegel between February and May 1799. Since the Stewart commentary itself has not been preserved, and the only available source for this work is a brief report in the biography of Hegel by Rosenkranz, a student of the German philosopher, it has been suggested that, quote, it would be advisable to refrain from any remarks based on mere speculation, end quote. Sayama, 2004. Ernst Erdős, who has described Hegel as a, quote, critic of bourgeois society and the terrain of bourgeois society, end quote, considers the Stuttgart-born philosopher to be a follower of neither Smith nor Stewart. By contrast, Erdős insists that Hegel's independence is worth emphasizing. Other interpreters challenge the idea that Hegel operated on the level of the modern, Anglo-Saxon political economy of his time. Finally, it is important to note the fundamental difference between the Hegelian and Marxian relations to political economy. Hegel clearly marked out a position in relation to political economy in the section on the, quote, system of needs, end quote, in his Doctrine on Civil Society, in the book Elements of the Philosophy of Right. However, his doctrine of civil society is thematized within his philosophy of right, which is a component of the philosophy of objective spirit and thus part of his philosophical system. By contrast, Marx was concerned to provide a fundamental critique of the science of political economy and simultaneously to revolutionize it theoretically, rather than merely seeking, as did Hegel, to integrate into a philosophical system some of the insights gained as a result of a critical engagement with this discipline. Accordingly, the economic research carried out by Marx, in particular his critical engagement with economic science, was located not only in a totally different theoretical and programmatic context, but was also incomparably more intensive than that undertaken by Hegel. Marx's exposition in Capital presupposes the total theoretical penetration of his object, including the internal interconnection between economic categories and relations. Such a project was undertaken by Marx and not by Hegel. Before parts of the international discussion of the Hegel-Marx relation can be considered more closely, it is necessary to briefly indicate some passages of Marx's texts and correspondence which afford an insight into Marx's own understanding of his theoretical relation to Hegel. In the famous postface to the second edition of the first volume of Marx's Capital, Marx writes the following, quote, "My dialectical method is in its foundations not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it," end quote. According to Marx, Hegel transforms the process of thinking under the name of the idea into an independent subject and into the, quote, demiurge of the real, end quote, such that the real merely forms the external manifestation of the idea. Marx contrasts his own position, quote, "With me the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought," end quote. Marx continues as follows, quote, "I criticized the mystificatory side of the Hegelian dialectic nearly 30 years ago, at a time when it was still the fashion, but just when I was working at the first volume of Capital, the ill-humored, arrogant, and mediocre epigons who now talk large and educated German circles began to take pleasure in treating Hegel in the same way as the good Moses Mendelssohn treated Spinoza in Lessing's time, namely as a, quote, dead dog," end quote, Marx. Marx states that this had prompted him to profess himself Hegel's pupil, and that he had occasionally coquetted with Hegel's mode of expression. Quote, "The mystification which the dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents Hegel from being the first to present its general forms of motion in a comprehensive and concise manner. With him it is standing on its head. It must be inverted in order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell," end quote. Marx. Marx's critique is directed at the, quote, mystification of dialectic or method at the hands of Hegel. In his letter of 16th January 1858, Marx states that his leafing through of Hegel's logic has been of, quote, great use to him as, quote, regards method of treatment, end quote, and gives notice of a project which he presumably never realized. Quote, "If ever the time comes when such work is again possible, I should very much like to write 2 or 3 sheets, making accessible to the common reader the rational aspect of the method, which Hegel not only discovered but also mystified," end quote. Marx. No such text was published by Marx or to be found in the materials contained in his literary estate. In a letter to Lassalle, dated 31st of May 1858, Marx expressed his opinion that Hegelian dialectic is the ultimate word in philosophy, but it is necessary to, quote, divest it of the mystical aura given it by Hegel, end quote. Marx. Over a decade later, Marx was prompted in an exchange with Ludwig Kugelmann to refer critically to the, quote, mystical form of the dialectic in Hegel. In his letter of the 6th of March 1868, Marx writes that the reviewer of Marx's Capital, Eugen Düring, knows very well that, quote, "My method of exposition is not Hegelian, since I am a materialist and Hegel is an idealist. Hegel's dialectic is the basic form of all dialectic, but only after being stripped of its mystical form, and it is precisely this which distinguishes my method," end quote. Marx. Shortly after, on the 9th of May 1868, Marx advised Joseph Dietzken as follows, quote, "When I have cast off the burden of political economy, I shall write a, quote, dialectic. The true laws of dialectics are already contained in Hegel, though in a mystical form. What is needed is to strip away this form," end quote. Marx. The author of Capital recognized that the method of exposition which was to elucidate and develop the internal interconnections of the capitalist economy was necessarily given by the latter's structure itself. Rather than establishing a, quote, a priori construction, end quote, as Marx puts it in his postface to the 1873 second edition of the first volume of Capital, the, quote, object must first be sufficiently penetrated in a specific structure by means of a protracted and detailed process of inquiry in order to make possible an explanation and development of the object's internal interconnections in the exposition. Marx's approach was too differentiated to be considered a mere external, quote, transfer or, quote, application of Hegelian logic or method to the economy. In his letter of the 1st of February 1858 to Engels, Marx, referring to Lassalle, had already indicated precisely how not to proceed with Hegelian logic. Quote, "It is plain to me from this one note that, in his second grand opus, the fellow intends to expound political economy in the manner of Hegel, he will discover to his cost that it is one thing for a critique to take a science to the point at which it admits of a dialectical presentation, and quite another to apply an abstract ready-made system of logic to vague presentiments of just such a system. Marx. Various interpretations of the Hegel-Marx relation will be presented in what follows. No more than a minimal selection of contributions to the international debate on this question can be considered here. However, as it is beyond the scope of the present study to provide anything like an adequate survey of this debate since 1980, with the exception of a brief presentation of the interpretive approach of Fred Schrader, the following exposition focuses on contributions from the Anglo-Saxon discussion, given the prominent role played by the interpretation of the Hegel-Marx relation in the latter context. In a pioneering study published in 1980 on Marx's preparatory work for Capital, in the period from 1850 to 1858, Fred Schrader advanced the thesis that the comments made by Marx on his relation to Hegel's in his relation to Hegel's book Logic, while drafting the Grundrisse, i.e. that he had leafed through Hegel's logic, which had been of great use to him in terms of his own method of treatment, are to be taken literally. Quote, no significant reception of Hegel occurred, no world spirit was thus revealed to be capital, nor yet was it a matter of deciphering an identity between the movements of an essence and those of value. End quote. According to Schrader, a partial analogy with respect certain aspects of Hegelian logic in the chapter on money in the Grundrisse, Schrader acknowledges that this analogy can be drawn, is given by certain parallels between aspects of Hegelian logic and material used by Marx in certain places. To what does this, quote, material refer? In Schrader's view, it can be argued that there are indeed correspondences to Hegel in the book The Grundrisse, in the context of Marx's reception of the economists, Sismondi, Storch, and Say. More precisely, these correspondences are given by parallels between certain dimensions of Hegelian logic and aspects of the considerations of these economists with regard to the theories of money and capital. Quote, following Marx's references, it can be established that Quote, following Marx's reference, it can be established that at decisive junctures in his Rohentwerf, and in fact in those very passages which correspond to Hegelian logic, he relied on Sismondi, Storch, and Say, not only in an economic and factual sense, but also conceptually and even in terms of his overall conception. End quote. Fred Schrader. Schrader has since reassessed the results of his research that he first published in 1980. He now argues that what is to be clarified is whether, when and where Marx relates to Hegelian logic, to Spinoza's concept of substance, or to Leibniz's logic of relations. At stake in this inquiry, according to Schrader, are important findings with regard to Marx's modus operandi. Schrader argues that it is conceivable, on the one hand, that Marx proceeds on a completely eclectic and pragmatic basis, that his mode of operation was characterized by unsystematic improvisation, influenced by his current reading at any given point in time, with a, quote, specific concept, quote, fitting, particularly well at any given juncture, end quote. Schrader. Schrader recognizes that this point of view bears a similarity to his own interpretation in 1980. Quote, on the other hand, Schrader continues, quote, it might be suspected that this usage is not quite so innocent after all, and that behind the quote, Marx is in fact also establishing a relation to the author quoted. In both cases, the question of the status of conceptuality would have to be posed, end quote. Schrader. One dimension of Schrader's due intervention on the issue of the Hegel-Marx relation consists in his questioning of the frequent tendency to privilege the book Science of Logic or the book Philosophy of Right in interpretations of Marx's method and his relation to the Stuttgart-born philosopher. The book Phenomenology of Spirit could arguably also be added to the above works. Quote, other published works by Hegel, which were undoubtedly read by Marx, are not taken into consideration. These include the Encyclopedia and not merely the, quote, lesser logic, end quote, but also the Philosophy of Objective Spirit, in which Hegel integrates logic and social theory into a whole system, end quote. Fred Schrader. Schrader himself deserves credit for having caused slightly more attention to be focused on the, quote, lesser logic contained in the Encyclopedia and particularly on its rather neglected reception by Marx. An excerpt by Marx from this work by Hegel was published by Schrader in collaboration with Joseph O'Malley in the 1970s. I'm curious about this Joseph O'Malley person. They seem like they had some kind of significance, at least on the publication level, relating to Marx research in the United States, because he also he also was responsible, I think, for the publication of Maximilien Rubel's works, or at least a portion of them, into the English language. Anyway, where am I? A little more than 3 decades ago, the Marx interpreter Sean Sayers felt compelled to insist to the Anglo-Saxon readership that dialectic is not a mere absurdity. Footnote, quote, "What then is dialectic? First of all, one must see that it is not a mere absurdity, but a philosophy, a logic, a way of seeing the world," end quote. Sean Sayers. End footnote. In the intervening period, the discussion centering around Christopher Arthur, Tony Smith, and others, a discussion which is of significance for the debate on dialectic, has become ever more established within Anglo-Saxon research into Marx. It would appear that Arthur identifies a decisive key to an adequate reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy, precisely in his reference to Hegel's logic. An edited volume published in 1993 by Fred Mosley represents a milestone in the development of the Hegel-Marx debate within the Anglo-Saxon reception of Marx. The 3 of the interpretive approaches included in this volume will be presented here. Footnote. A follow-up volume featuring contributions from a virtually identical list of authors was published 4 years later. Mosley has also published an important edited volume on Marx's theory of money. It's the the International Symposium for Marxist Theory, which is where I learned so much about the critique of political economy. So I couldn't recommend any of their text enough. Particularly helpful for me, especially, and probably more so for a lot of people. I think especially, they have they're like, one of the reasons I first read them was because they're the only group that had like an entire book about Volume 2 of Capital. Yeah. End footnote. Footnote. The three volumes referred to here are Mosley 1993, Mosley and Campbell 1997, and Mosley 2005, are associated with the International Symposium on Marxian Theory, an international forum for researchers with an interest in systematic dialectic and value form theory established on the initiative of Fred Mosley in 1990. I'm going to say that this is slightly incorrect because, for one, this symposium has had people that definitely fall out of that spectrum, and I don't know if you can include Fred Mosley in this. I don't think I'd be cautious about saying that Fred Mosley is a value form theorist or a systematic dialectician. But other people within it most certainly are. Christopher Arthur and Tony Smith definitely, Riccardo Bellafiore and Patrick Murray more in that orbit. Gert Reuten, obviously in that Reuten, Roberto Finesci. I'm not listing these names off my head. It's they're right here, but all these people, I wouldn't include Mosley himself. Mosley spearheaded it, but it seems like he's not particularly into a lot of the things that a lot of the theorists concluded. He might think they're sophisticated and respects them, and he seems like a very nice guy, but Fred Mosley is very much opposed to he's not particularly pro-Rubin or anything like that. He seems way more, I would say, it seems like he's way more in the world of
I don't know, Paul-matic influence. Anyway, he just wrote a big book about against Marx. It's a book that's a critique of Heinrich's reading of Capital. Anyway, Christopher Arthur's Hegelianizing approach has already been referred to in the expositional survey of the Anglo-Saxon discussion of Marx given above. In Arthur's view, the question of how Marx's critique of political economy benefited from his appropriation of Hegelian logic is to be taken very seriously. Arthur draws attention to the significance of form theory and thus echoes Helmut Brentel's interventions in the West German Marx discussion of the 1980s. Quote, "It is agreed by all intelligent Marxists that the question of social form is the key to the Marxian understanding of economic systems." End quote. Arthur. Accordingly, Arthur argues that, quote, "Marxist theory needs a science of form," end quote. Arthur. An important distinction established by the British philosopher is that between systematic and historical dialectic. Quote, "On the whole, Marx is trying to use systematic dialectic as I do," end quote. Which is more oriented instead of historical dialectic being about succession, temporally of forms, right? So a historical dialectic might be about dialectic of the movement from one mode of production to another. This is my understanding of it, at least. Where systematic dialectic is about a theoretical organization of the categories, which you might call an organic whole, in which the different categories presuppose one another. And so it's that seems to be what the core of systematic dialectics is about producing, giving expression to the anatomy of an organic system in thought. As opposed to some kind of temporal kind of exposition, right? Anyway, Arthur criticizes Marx's exposition for its premature introduction of abstract labor as the substance of value, which causes some readers to see a, quote, embodied labor theory of value, end quote, in Marx. Indeed, for certain form theorists within the Anglo-Saxon discussion, such a, quote, embodied labor theory of value, end quote, within the appears to be something of a specter to be exercised in any adequate reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy. And one of Arthur's main reasons for this is that the exchange relation theoretically precedes theoretically precedes any reference to labor, right? I think one of the things he says is something to the effect of commodities that are exchanged are not necessarily labor products, right? And so you have to begin with exchange, and then eventually I think he waits till you start introduce the category of capital and capital sinking into production, that you can then introduce abstract labor into the discussion. But doing that right out of the gate, as Marx does, Marx talks about abstract labor, in the first chapter of Capital, for Arthur, to my understanding at least, is a theoretical mistake, which causes confusion. Anyway, that's my memory of it. It might be asked in this context whether Arthur might have been influenced by the Uno school, which likewise considers that Marx introduced abstract labor as the substance of value prematurely in his exposition. In relation to Hegel's logic, Arthur writes the following, quote, "I think that the relationship between Hegel's logic and the value form is much closer than that of an external identification of its logical structure or a methodologically motivated application of its norms of adequacy, or an expositional strategy that finds it convenient to move from simpler to more complex structures," end quote. Arthur. It should be noted that when Arthur uses the term, quote, value form in this context, he refers not merely to the value form analysis in the narrow sense, but to a system comprising various moments, the commodity, money, and capital. The British philosopher continues as follows, quote, I believe that in some sense the value form and Hegel's logic are to be identified. We are not simply applying Hegel's logic to an independent content. It is not that the value form happens to generate structures of complexity mapped by Hegel in his logical categories. The forms are in effect of such abstract purity as to constitute a real incarnation of the world of the ideas of Hegel's logic, and quote. According to Arthur, however, it is precisely the proximity to Hegel's logic which casts a critical light on Marx's object. The latter represents, on Arthur's view, an inverted reality which is systematically alienated from its bearers. It is, quote, an object that in its spiritualization of material interchange and practical activities into the heaven of pure forms virtually incarnates the Hegelian, quote, idea, end quote, unquote. Arthur. The material abstraction or, quote, real abstraction of the exchange process constitutes a specific reality of, quote, pure forms. With regard to its conceptual content, the peculiar relation which Arthur establishes to Hegel in this context is a specifically socially critical bearing. The significance of this circumstance is underlined by a controversy between Arthur and the Marx researcher Tony Smith, which took place in 2003. On that occasion, Arthur observed that the difference between his own approach and that of Smith consisted in the fact that the latter, quote, criticizes capitalism for failing to live up to the demands of Hegel's philosophy, whereas I think it is to be criticized precisely because it does so. I argue this is so because it is a system of self-moving abstraction. Obviously, we must be reading Hegel very differently. I agree with the Marx of 1843, 1857, and 1872 that Hegel inverts the relation between thought and being. My innovation is to argue that capital is also an inverted reality with a parallel logic, end quote. Arthur. In his contribution to the same edited volume of 1993, Tony Smith attempted to identify two different types of dialectical theory in Hegel. Quote, the first concerns the dialectics of history. Hegel believed that there is a sort of development underlying both world history and the history of art, religion, and philosophy. Dialectics was the term he used to refer to this logic of development, end quote. Smith. The American interpreter of Hegel and Marx characterizes the second type of dialectical theory in Hegel as follows, quote, however, the second sort of dialectical theory, found in writings such as the book, The Science of Logic, and the book, The Philosophy of Right, is our sole concern here. This may be termed systematic dialectics and is concerned with the ordering of categories from the simple and abstract to the complex and concrete. This ordering does not coincide with the order of events in history, end quote. Smith. Smith focuses in particular on the type of dialectical theory in Hegel and draws on, quote, systematic dialectic, end quote. The American Marx researcher argues that, quote, Marx did indeed make use of a systematic dialectical method similar to that found in Hegel, end quote. Tony Smith. Smith's interpretation thus displays a similarity to that of Arthur. Smith, too, distinguishes the systematic dialectic upon which he draws from any, quote, historical dialectic. For Smith, the dialectical logic in Marx's critique of political economy consists in the systematic progression from one level of abstraction to the next, and more precisely in the circumstance that this occurs on the basis of a, quote, necessary derivation, end quote, of each categorical level from the preceding one. What are the grounds of this necessity? The necessity of the derivation is materially grounded in the practice of social agents. Derivations are justified if and only if we can show that social agents operating within one social form would necessarily tend to act in a manner that leads to the introduction of a new social form, end quote. Smith. Although without a doubt a representative of a kind of, quote, systematic dialectical reading of Marx's Capital, Smith understands Marx's magnum opus to be another much more complex work. To be altogether a much more complex work. Smith expands on this point as follows, quote, Marx's Capital includes many dimensions that cannot be reduced to the systematic progression of economic categories, The systematic dialectic reading does not incorporate the whole of the book, end quote. Smith. Nonetheless, the American Marx interpreter maintains that quote, systematic dialectic captures the leitmotif of capital, its underlying theoretical architectonic. I just want to say, as a person, for one, what else to say? Definitely read Tony Smith's book Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism. I think that's a very fundamental book, in my opinion, and that it also kind of has the very helpful category of beyond, right? I feel like people, I think one of the I think he uses the concept. It's about like the limitations of people, say like Jürgen Habermas, but I think primarily people that are kind of like in the Anglophonic, analytic, moral political philosophy tradition. So primarily like people like John Rawls and others, who have, and it's very like sympathetic to their thought, right? The concept of like justice is fairness and things of that sort. But for Smith basically underlines that due to their inadequate conception of capital, which is based upon not upon the Marxian critique of political economy, but rather bourgeois social science, fail to realize that the social goods that they desire are not compatible with capitalism, whatever social policies any particular state might advance, right? So it's arguing for like a concept of socialism that moves beyond capital and thus become beyond conceptional socialism that are like a thickening and extension of the welfare state, right? But I think the very important thing that I got from that book is that Smith makes this really brilliant distinction, and maybe it's something from otherwhere else. One of the main things, well, first is like beyond, right? So he's acknowledging the merits of like bourgeois liberalism, and also like some of the merits of social democracy, right? He's acknowledging that there's merits to them, but there's also very, very severe limits placed upon them by the fact that the orienting principle of society is capital accumulation, right? And private property, basically, right? Makes an argument that there's things are limitations. So he has that concept of beyond, which I think is so much more helpful than just being merely anti, right? And it's so much more helpful. It's a very more balanced and convincing than being like I'm anti-liberal or something like that. And it shows the it emphasizes the distinction between like a radical social emancipatory critique of liberalism versus other critiques of liberalism, which unfortunately I think large sections of the left fail ultimately to distinguish between. Anyway, that's one thing about it, but he emphasizes this really brilliant thing that I think is so good, where he says, while Marx was not a methodological individualist, right? The idea that like social structures of capitalism cannot be deduced from a conception about human nature and what human beings are like, right? Marx totally rejects, for instance, Adam Smith's remarks that kind of Adam Smith basically says what makes a human being a human being is commodity production, truck barter and trade, right? Marx rejects that whole thing, right? Capitalism is an emergent system that has top-down causation, causal it has causes on human behavior in like a top-down way, right? It's has effects on like the human substratum beneath, I guess, or like what human being. Basically, capitalism influences or dictates to a large extent the things people do on the practical everyday level, right? And it's not some kind of like, and what human beings do on everyday level is not some manifestation of some kind of trans-historical human nature, right? So Marx rejects that, right? Marx rejects that kind of methodological individualism when analyzing capitalist society, or probably any society in general, right? Or maybe not. I don't know about all that. But he is an ethical individualist, which I think is super interesting, because we're talking about the abolition of private property as a means to social emancipation. There's this kind of like thing that like Marx is therefore like against human individuality, but Smith makes a real important distinction that for Marx, the precondition, the full and free development of each individual is the precondition for the full and free development of all, right? This kind of taking it back to what makes a society good or not is the degree to which it satisfies the flourishing of human individuals, right? That is a key for Marx, right? How society ultimately affects the individual person. The social individual, right? So that's a very important distinction, I think, the distinction between like methodological individualism in social sciences and like ethical individualism, which I think is very interesting and not something that's particularly pointed out enough. And I'd like to reread that book at some point because it was really, really tremendous. The other thing that I want to say is that when I was an undergraduate and I was looking to go to master's program, I emailed Tony Smith because I liked his work so much about people who could potentially, because he taught at like a college that didn't have like a graduate program in philosophy, and he didn't work with graduate students or anything like that. And despite that, he was extremely helpful and like went out of his way to like tell me like options that I might had. Him and Patrick Murray were two people I reached out to that were like extremely helpful, and seemed genuinely interested in wanting to like give me some pointers in like people that I could potentially work with. I ultimately didn't take any of the things that they did, but the fact that they like spent time out of their day to fucking email some nobody from nowhere about grad schools, very nice of them. Anyway, moving on. At the beginning of the 1990s, Smith published a monograph presenting his conception of Marx's capital as a theory of economic categories that are structured in their relation to one another in accordance with the dialectical logic that Marx appropriated from Hegel. According to Smith, the dialectical method applied by Marx is to be understood as a systematic categorical progression. Smith's interpretive approach is also noteworthy insofar as he attempts to define the criteria that a theory of categories must satisfy, quote, if it is to capture adequately the imminent unfolding of the subject matter, end quote. Smith. Firstly, the theoretical starting point is of decisive importance. The simplest and most abstract category is to be selected as the point of departure, such that the remaining categories can be derived from it. Secondly, a linear progression must be given in the sequence of categories, such that the transition from one category to the next is necessarily grounded in their specific content. Thirdly, quote, there is the question of the general categorical/ontological framework used throughout the theory, end quote. Smith. Smith adds that, quote, when he defined the categories, quote, commodity, quote, money, quote, capital, and so on, Marx did so in terms of a specific categorical framework found in Hegel's logic, one taken from the level of essence, Wesen, end quote. Tony Smith. The American Marx interpreter argues that the systematic dialectical logic, which is evident in Marx's Capital from beginning to end, displays no methodological ambiguity. Yet, according to Smith, Marx made concessions to his readership. He played down the, quote, systematic nature of the theory, end quote, and emphasized, quote, much more accessible historical components of the work, end quote. Smith. Smith further comments that an alternative for Marx would have been to anticipate Lenin's famous aphorism, quote, it is impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists understood Marx, end quote. Lenin. According to the American Marx researcher Patrick Murray, a parallel can be drawn between Hegel's logic of essence and Marx's theory of value. Murray refers to the problem of essence and manifestation and observes that Hegel considered that the essence must manifest itself, or to put it more precisely, quote, the essence must appear as something other than itself, end quote. According to Murray, Hegel's essence of logic, quote, whereby the essence necessarily appears as something other than itself, whereby the essence necessarily appears as something other than itself, is the pivotal conceptual resource founding Marx's theory of value. Value necessarily appears as something other than itself, namely money, price, end quote. Murray. Footnote. See also Murray's monograph on Marx's theory of scientific knowledge, particularly chapters 11, 13 to 16, 18, 19, where this argument is situated more broadly within the context of Marx's critical appropriation, within his mature critique of political economy, of Hegelian logic, and Hegelian philosophy more generally. End footnote. Murray emphasizes the significance for the critique of political economy of Marx's critical engagement with Hegel, by means of which Marx appropriated, quote, conceptual resources that enabled him to overcome Ricardo's theories of value and capital, end quote. The American interpreter of Marx's Capital formulates his point as follows, quote, I argue that it is precisely the lessons learned from Hegel that make capital great, end quote. Murray. Murray opposes the view that Marx merely adopted Ricardo's labor theory of value. There can be no doubt that Murray is correct on this score, and argues that Marx moved beyond the traditional understanding of the problem of essence and manifestation, quote, which fails to show that essence, value, must appear as money, end quote. According to Murray, Marx himself was able to demonstrate this. Murray develops the point as follows, quote, once we recognize that value is, namely an abstract, self-reflexive, quote, social objectivity, it is evident that it can have no immediate appearance, end quote. Murray. It might be added here that the peculiarity of the concept of value itself, provided this is correctly grasped, necessitates a unity of the theories of value and money. With regard to these later theories, the American interpreter of Marx develops his argument as follows, quote, because it is an abstraction, a being of reflection, value cannot appear immediately. It must appear as something other than itself. Money proves to be the necessary form of value's appearance, and to be necessary for value's existence, yet money is not value, end quote. Murray. Murray's point could be expressed as follows, is by means of Marx's critique of political economy that the categories abstract, labor, value, and money can be correctly grasped. Murray's reading of Marx points in a similar direction to that indicated by the content which has emerged in the German language discussion in connection with the research carried out by Hans-Georg Backhaus, and which can be described as the, quote, monetary theory of value, end quote. The interpretive approaches of Tony Smith and Patrick Murray serve to demonstrate, among other things, that a positive reference to Hegel's philosophy has become established within a part of the Anglo-Saxon discussion of the critique of political economy in recent times. Thinkers such as Louis Althusser, who is widely received in the English-speaking world, particularly in the 1970s, and Galvano della Volpe had established a sharp demarcation between Marx and Hegel, and attempted to distance Marx from Hegel. A completely different interpretive tendency seems to have developed and gathered strength in the Anglo-Saxon Marx debate of the last few decades. Yet this tendency in turn has not remained uncontested. Quote, anti-Hegelian resistance, end quote, has also been offered, as is exemplified by the interpretive approach which will now be outlined. A further important work of Anglo-Saxon provenance is Jan Rosenthal's The Myth of Dialectics, published in 1998. In this study, Rosenthal is concerned to find a third way beyond the alternative of Hegelian Marxism and analytic Marxism. In his endeavor, he invokes the unity of the theories of value, value form, and money in Marx. Quote, Marx's so-called, quote, value theory is from the outset a theory of money, and a theory of money, I am suggesting, in a unique sense, which finds no exact parallel in either neoclassical economics or classical political economy, end quote. Yeah, just as a side note, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that was kind of the kind of impression that I was getting when I was reading the introduction to Rosenthal's book, is that he like accepts a lot of the things that like people who are very influenced by Hegelian receptions of the critique of political economy would agree with. Like, it seems like he's very much of the point that, like, yeah, Marx is not a Ricardian. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm misremembering what I read. Anyway, Rosenthal argues that it would also be an error to regard Marx as a Ricardian. Oh, there we are. God, I know what I'm talking about. As far as the theory of value is concerned, on this point, it can be conceded to Rosenthal that he has correctly grasped an essential aspect of Marx's theory of value, which is sometimes overlooked in the English-speaking world and beyond, namely that there's a fundamental difference between Marx's and Ricardo's respective theories of value. Rosenthal further asserts that there is an analogy, although not a homology, between Marx's theory of value and money on the one hand and Hegel's exposition of the, quote, concept on the other. Rosenthal argues that according to Marx, money is to be grasped as a, quote, real universal, a generality viz. The common character of all commodities as, quote, exchange values, end quote, which is acquired independent existence in the form of some determinate commodity or, quote, use value, end quote. Rosenthal. There exists a, quote, unmistakable isomorphism, end quote, between Hegel's, quote, idea and the, quote, real form of economic value, viz. Money, end quote. Yet Rosenthal takes up an ambiguous position against Hegel and against any, quote, Hegelianizing reading of Marx. In Germany, Rosenthal's book has been vehemently criticized. The philosopher Michal Quanta. I don't have anything by this guy on this channel, but I think he has lectures that I have saved to watch. In Germany, Rosenthal's book has been vehemently criticized. The philosopher Michal Quanta censors its author for failing to present a treatment of the question of Marx's relation to Hegel free from the interference of political, quote, positioning. Quote, anyone who might have believed that this lamentable feature of Marx research were now a thing of the past will learn from reading Rosenthal's book that this is sadly not the case, end quote. Quanta sees Hegel shunted off to the corner of the political right in Rosenthal's monograph. Quanta further argues that Rosenthal's work is characterized by a complete, quote, lack of familiarity with and a, quote, prejudiced distortion of Hegel's philosophy. This critique can be countered, however, by the recognition that Rosenthal's interpretation of Marx's theory of value is a useful reference in relation to a number of important points. New section. Summary. Since the 1960s and 1970s, a fundamental characteristic of scientific engagement with Marx's critique of political economy has consisted in the increased focus on Marx's process of inquiry and on his specific exposition. As far as Marx's exposition is concerned, the question of the ascent from the abstract to the concrete and the problem of the beginning have proved to be central points of reference for the reception of Marx. Attention was already devoted to these themes in the 1960s, and the theory which has been formed in relation to these questions also constitutes an important aspect of the period within the history of the reception of Marx, stretching back to the 1980s. The insights to be preserved here is that Marx's form of exposition necessarily corresponds to the specific structure of his economic object. With regard to the relation between Hegel's and Marx's method, which is of great relevance to the problematic of the exposition, the key observation to be retained is that this relation is by no means to be reduced to the simple external, quote, application or, quote, transfer of Hegel's method to an alien, quote, object. Furthermore, an important conclusion, vis-a-vis the interpretation of the Hegel-Marx relation in general, is that it is not only the science of logic which is to be considered in this context, rather, other texts by the Stuttgart-born philosopher with which Marx engaged critically must also be brought into relation. Since the 1990s in particular, a certain tendency has gained an increasing profile within the international interpretation of the critique of political economy, namely the interpretive current which is characterized by a more open or positive relation to Hegel's philosophy in marked contrast to the, quote, anti-Hegelian positions of Althusser and Coletti. It seems to me that a condition for a productive future debate on the problematic of Marx's, quote, dialectical exposition is above all that the question of dialectic be discussed in relation to the specific problems of economic theory which Marx attempted to solve in his exposition.
Footnote. It should be emphasized, however, that the question of dialectic should not be restricted to the problematic of the exposition, since dialectic also exists precisely within the real object of Marx's critique of political economy. And that is the end of section 2 of chapter 3 of Marx Worldwide on the Development of the International Discourse of Marx since 1965 by Jan Hoff, translated by Nicholas Gray. Chapter 3 of the book is titled In-Depth Analyses, Central Discourses Within the German and International Discussions of Marx from the 1980s to the Present. And, did I say section 3? It's section 2. Section 2 of chapter 3 is titled The Problem of Inquiry and Exposition in the Critique of Political Economy, and it had the headings, a quote, Mont Blanc of research material, the ascent from the abstract to the concrete, and the quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, in Marx's presentation, the relation of Marx's critique of political economy to Hegel's philosophy as reflected in the international debate. And that's the end of the section. Thank you so much for listening.